Welcome to episode 9 of How I Topped the CPALE over subject 4, which is auditing. And spoiler alert, I hate auditing. Actually, auditing is my least favorite subject. I used to hate the subject with a passion, and it was mostly because of audit theory. Actually, it was only because of audit theory. I hate audit theory. I couldn't understand it in undergrad, and I couldn't understand it in my first few days of official review. Auditing problem was never really that big of a problem for me because it was mostly far and it was challenging. Actually, auditing problem was horrible for us in undergrad because our teacher for the subject was very hardcore and his exams were like the worst. They were like the hardest exams I ever faced. And in a sense, it really strengthened my audit foundation. I think the biggest reason why audit is turned out to be okay for me in review was because he really conditioned our foundation in undergrad to be way harder than what it is in the actual board exam. So you win some, but you lose some. And in my case, I lost a bit of sanity there because audit theory was already not giving, and audit problems were like 5 pages long for us. So that was an experience. Auditing ended up being the subject I honestly found the easiest one in the board exam. Like I went through it and I was like, oh my gosh, I can do this. Like it's possible, you know? And I was expecting to be kind of like scared. Like I was confident that I finally understood things and that I wouldn't be that shaken, but there was still a little level of fear that I would mix things up or that I would start to revert to my hatred for auditing and like overanalyze and second guess because of that. But it turned out to not be that way. And so I actually walked away from the exam feeling really light and feeling like, yes, it's bearable. I could do it. But funnily enough, that didn't really like reflect in my results. I thought auditing was the easiest subject I answered out of the 6 back in December, but it ended up ranking as my 5th out of 6 subjects. So in essence, auditing was my second lowest. But I still passed, so thank you, Lord. So we used a few books in undergrad during auditing. Actually, we used this one that I have over here, which is the Cabrera book. This is what we were prescribed. It's the only book that I have after the moment. And to be honest, what I struggled with was really the material of audit theory. So book aside, because I was looking at other resources for it, audit theory was just like a mess to me. And for the longest time, I couldn't understand the ways and like the structures of the different topics, like everything mixed together. I know that there's different phases and stages of the audit cycle. So like risk assessment, risk response, risk reporting. But really in my first few days, in my first semester of going through audit, it all jumbled together. And it was like such a mess trying to organize my notes when I finally entered official review because I really didn't understand the structure of everything. And it was also info overload because there were just like so many little subtopics like materiality, performance specific, and like aggregation. And it was just a mess. So if that's how you're feeling with audit theory, you are valid. You are so valid. I know a lot of people who hate audit theory, and high five. I hated audit theory. But then when I got to review season, I started to finally master this really difficult subject. And that was really mainly because I just kept going. I just kept going at it. So with the amount of times I would repeat theory questions, with the amount of times I'd go over the concepts, it eventually started to like form that place in my mind. So like when I read this keyword, it would activate, okay, this is the portion of audit that deals with this. And then when I'd come across a question that touched on the audit sampling techniques, and then I'd be like, okay, compartmentalize your knowledge and touch on this. And that was something that I had no other choice but to build through time. Like it was really just repeated patterns of not giving up and of continuing to show up even if I hated audit and even if I felt like it didn't make sense still. I just kept walking forward and I looked up one day and somehow it started to make sense. Um don't know if that's your journey with audit. Maybe you're someone who magically gets it at first glance, unlike me. But that was really the subject that I struggled the most with. And it was hard finding certain study techniques to make me like it more because I just really didn't like the material. I found it so theoretical. And that's probably why I only really appreciated audit problems at first, because then again, it was application. And application for me is where things made sense. But nonetheless, audit theory is like filled with insights. And actually, this is the bulk of the board exam. The trend nowadays at it's like 60 to 65 questions of audit theory, and then only, let's say, like five, at most 10 questions of audit problems. So people will really prioritize audit theory when reviewing for audit, and they will only put audit problem together mostly with FAR, like hitting those two birds with one stone there, so that when it's audit studying time, it's really about audit theory because that is the bulk of the board exam. And true enough, that really was the bulk of it during our exam, as expected. So other than this book I have here, other really helpful audit resources, there's actually the PSA standards. And again, same discussion with FAR. If you're someone considering to go through all the PSAs and read them word for word, if that works for you, then go ahead. For me, again, it didn't. I didn't go through the PSAs. So there was a point in undergrad wherein we tried to, and we were advised to by our teacher, but it didn't happen. Like, I did skim over it, but I didn't take it in word for word. But I found that by going through all the other resources I did, whether that be books or handouts or summaries online, it really essentially copies from the standard word for word. So it was like basically reading tidbits of the standard verbatim. There's a lot of test banks likewise with audit, and these are the resources I would recommend the most out of everything. For me, this is where I mastered it by continuously answering different kinds of audit theory test banks. So there's Wiley. There's also a lot from different review centers. And actually, as you accumulate them over pre-boards and different exams, even undergrad that you answer, you will really build familiarization with the different types of questions. I hated them at first, particularly those questions that were so subjective. Like it felt like different choices could be possible answers. And sometimes, like it would depend on the person who made the question. Sometimes when you read the reasoning behind multiple choice answers, you can argue that it can be this. And that was where it was so confusing for me because it didn't feel like there was this one straight rule. It wasn't super objective in my perception. But perhaps that's like the beauty of audit, and where you have to apply professional skepticism and all that. That was the foreignness that I just personally felt with audit, and I really turned to those test banks and to those questions and like reviewing and practicing to eventually get down the essence of what questions we're asking for and what kind of concepts and theories I needed to apply for a certain question. For audit problems, also, just really quickly, I don't have a physical copy of the book here, but one of the best ones we really used were the Ocampo and Roque books for audit problems. Those were very heavy on us at undergrad because our teacher really devoted so much time and so much questions to audit problems. So it became like audit problem was our majority of our studying rather than audit theory. And that was what reversed an official review because the exam was the opposite. But that's why we touched a lot on audit problems. So these books were our lifesavers back then. One other book I kind of wanted to mention is the Salo Sagkol book. So a lot of people use this because they found this more summarized. I think in a way it was easier to understand for them, and they did have some end of the chapter MCQ questions. So the version that I had, which I also bought from a friend, was it didn't have answer keys at the end, so I couldn't really check my answers. Honestly, I didn't use the book that much, but I thought it was worth mentioning because a lot of people I knew turned to this book. Now to go over the audit US, so for auditing, it's broken down to two, audit theory and audit problems. The first part, audit theory, is the entire audit cycle, the risk-based audit approach from fundamentals of auditing and assurance services, for the different kinds of assurance engagements there are, and also the non-assurance engagements, you've got to classify that, to the types of auditors and the types of assertions also. And then you go to the client acceptance, audit planning, supervision, and monitoring part. So overview of the risk-based audit process, all of the things I mentioned, like those subtopics like materiality and preliminary APs or analytical procedures, assessing the audit risks, and then understanding the entity, its environment. You have to know RMM, you have to know what that is composed of, what that formula is. And then it goes on to the risk response stage. So, uh, and then we also touch on audit objectives, procedures, evidences, and documentation. And one topic here that's memorable to me was like which kind of evidence is the most persuasive. Yeah, that was a common question that came up. And then also completing the audit, post-audit responsibilities, and the reports on audit financial statements. Now, this one was a bit of a superstar for me because at first I was also super confused between the different kinds of opinions and reports. There were modified, unmodified, disclaimer, and adverse opinion. So luckily, there's a lot of review center handouts and also just resources in general that lay down summaries of these for you to get them later on. Then there's auditing in the CIS environment, which was the harder topic for me. This, along with audit sampling, these two were the harder topics for me in audit theory because they were filled with more foreign terms for CIS, but also for audit sampling, like the different approaches and what kind of classification they'd be under. And they have a lot of keywords that I noticed a lot of audit theory questions really use. So those were things I looked out for and that I highlighted for me to remember. There's also attestation services topic, as well as the government ethics and quality management topic. So that one was kind of like we were unsure if this would be that big of a bulk because it's also kind of very varied in scope as the risk response phase and then the audit communication and reporting phase. So yeah, that's audit, and problems were applying different topics from far. So you never really know what kind of audit problems you could get. They usually classify it into like when we review, there's like audit of cash, audit of receivables, inventories, investments, audit of liabilities, audit of equity, and all that. So the one I just remembered I hated the most was audit of cash. I really hated it when they'd make us make like a proof of cash kind of reconciliation. Those were always the hardest for me to understand. And until when I took the board exam, I wasn't 100% confident in my ability to get it down in an actual problem. So, very honest to goodness, my prayer the night before was let any audit problem come out as long as it's not audit of cash. And true enough, what came out wasn't audit of cash. So, I was really happy. I was really happy. So don't be afraid to ask questions or to ask for help in those topics or really just the subjects that you struggle the most in. For me, that was audit. And I did ask a lot of questions, but I guess in the end, it did pay off. And I'm like eternally thankful also to all the people who really took the time to help me sort out my very, very messy memory of audit. So yeah, that was my experience with audit. Very mixed love-hate relationship, but still a really honestly satisfying one in the end after I was able to pass the board exam. So that was the fourth out of six subject. Thank you so much for still staying with me. We're almost at the end of this six-part episode. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share with anyone who you think might need also a lot of enlightening on audit. And I hope to see you in the next video where we'll be going over subject 5. So until then, thank you, stay safe, and bye.